So in the last video, we saw that Kant thinks the moral worth of an action comes from the rule that the action is following. In this video, we'll look at what he thinks the right kind of rule is, that is, the kind of rule that makes an action morally praiseworthy, and correspondingly we'll figure out the kind of rule that makes an action morally blameworthy, as well as the kind of rule that makes an action neither morally praiseworthy nor morally blameworthy. So it's kind of morally neutral. Okay, so here's the first condition. In order for an action to be morally praiseworthy, it must be motivated by a rule. Now, that raises a question: how could an action motivate a rule? How could a rule motivate an action? And let's consider by looking back at our sort of anatomy of action here. Suppose you have a desire to kill your friend, and you follow that desire. That leads you to deploy a rule that says use a gun. So you use a gun and you end up with a dead friend. That's the end. Here the action is motivated by a desire. Now, here's the crucial question. How can an action be motivated by the rule itself? Well, suppose there's a rule in your rule box that doesn't have a conditional form, doesn't have a hypothetical form. So this form, common to these two rules and common to what was here before, all of these rules share in common that their form is conditional or hypothetical. So they say, on the condition that you're inclined to kill your friend, then use a gun. On the condition that you want to walk across the screen, then walk. On the condition that you want to bake a recipe, then bake a cake, then follow the recipe. Put another way, given the hypothesis that you're inclined to kill your friend, you should use a gun. Given the hypothesis that you want to walk across the screen, then get across the screen, then you should walk, and so on and so forth. So these claims are known as conditionals or hypotheticals. And Kant thinks that many, many rules that we deploy in daily life have that conditional or hypothetical form. But he doesn't think all rules work that way. So contrast those with the following rule: don't kill. Don't kill is a straight command. It doesn't say if you don't want to go to jail, don't kill, or if you want to be nice, don't kill. It just says don't kill. It doesn't have a conditional or hypothetical form. Now, you wouldn't need a desire in order to act on that rule. You would just need to recognize that the rule has the form of a command and that the command applies to you. Of course, you need no means to do it, and the end result is that you haven't killed anybody. Now, suppose you have a command in here that says rob banks. Well, again, if that's a command, then you think that command applies to you. It doesn't really matter what you desire. You might say, I'm going to follow that command. And then you would, use whatever means is appropriate to robbing banks, and then you would end up robbing banks. Now, in these last two cases, the idea goes the action is motivated by the rule itself. So there is no desire that's coming along to activate the rule. The rule itself motivates the action. Why can that happen? Because the rule doesn't have a conditional form. It doesn't say on the condition that you want this, then do this. Instead, it just says don't do this or do this. So it has the form of an unconditional statement or a categorical. So the contrast class with conditional statements is unconditional statements, and the contrast class with hypothetical statements is categorical statements. Now, for us, we're just using conditional and hypothetical to mean the same thing, and unconditional and categorical to mean the same thing. In Kant's language, these sorts of things up here are called hypothetical imperatives. They're hypothetical because it's like on the hypothesis that you want to do this, do that. And it's an imperative because it's telling you what to do. Imperatives are statements that tell you what to do. So it's a hypothetical imperative, and then it says, if you want this, then do this. These statements down here are categorical imperatives. They don't say on the condition that you want this, do this, or on the hypothesis that you want this, do this. They just say do it or don't do it. They're categorical. It doesn't depend on a hypothesis. You could think of them as unconditional commands. And the idea is unconditional commands can motivate action. So here we have our two types of imperatives, our two types of rules. Hypothetical imperatives, Kant calls these conditional laws sometimes. They have the form if this, then that. Unconditional imperatives or categorical imperatives are called unconditional laws. They have the form do or don't do this or that. Examples: if you want that cake, then follow the recipe is a hypothetical imperative. Follow the recipe is a categorical imperative. It doesn't tell you about what you want, it's just a command. In order to become active, in order to become relevant, a hypothetical imperative has to affirm the antecedent. The antecedent is the beginning part of the conditional, the if part, in order to activate the law, which gives the consequent. The consequent is the second part. So for a hypothetical imperative, you need to activate the antecedent to activate the consequent. For a categorical imperative, there is no antecedent to activate. The law just commands, and it always commands. So one way to think about this is if the law is in this rule box here, it's just always commanding you. It doesn't wait for the antecedent to become activated in order to activate the consequent. In effect, this just is a consequent. It just is a command. It's just always telling you what to do or not to do. Okay. Now, that's one condition. It's a necessary condition for an action to be morally praiseworthy, that it be motivated by the rule. Okay? But it's not a sufficient condition. Why not? Because if it was a sufficient condition, then someone who is motivated by the rule, rob banks or kill everybody, their action would be morally praiseworthy because it was motivated by a rule. So it's a necessary condition that the action be motivated by a rule, but not a sufficient condition. So what else do we need? What further necessary condition do we need? What makes don't kill, let's say, better than rob banks? Presumably following the unconditional law, following the categorical imperative don't kill is morally praiseworthy, but following the categorical imperative rob banks is not. So what's the difference? And here we need to know more about what Kant thinks the right kind of rule is. So here's what Kant takes to be the sort of fundamental, central categorical imperative. That is the one such that if you follow it, your action is morally praiseworthy, and if you violate it, your action is morally blameworthy. He gives a few different formulations of the categorical imperative. We're going to focus just on this formulation. Act on a rule only if you can will it to be a universal law. Another formulation he gives is never treat someone as a mere means, only treat them as ends in themselves. He thinks these two formulations amount to the same thing. If you really understand them, you'll see that they're the same principle despite their superficial differences. But we're going to focus on this one. Only follow a rule if you can at the same time will it to be a universal law, at the same time meaning as you're following it. In order to understand this, we're going to have to do some careful analysis of the sentence and figure out, for example, what the word can means in this context. We're going to save that for the next video because that will take a little bit of work. Okay.